Second panel discussing Caitlin Zaloom's paper from the culture of risk to the ethics of liquidity. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Because I don't actually have it on the same page with your bio information. I'm Evelyn Tennant from the Department of Political Science, and I will be chairing and comment if there's time. This morning there wasn't. We ran a little short on time. So we're pleased to welcome Caitlin Zaloom, who is Associate Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis and Director of Metropolitan Studies at the New York University. And her areas of research are culture and economy, cities and globalization, financial markets, technology and cities, science and technology, and social theory. Her book, which the University of Chicago Press published in 2006, is Out of the Pits, Traders and Technology from Chicago to London. She's won many grants and awards, among them from the National Science Foundation and the Social Science Research Council. Her other publications include The Derivative World, The City as Value Locus, and How to Read the Future, The Yield Curve, Affect, and Financial Prediction. Shall I go ahead and introduce the discussants now? Okay. First will be Robert Fairbanks, who is Assistant Professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. He is an urban ethnographer and writes on welfare state theory and critical social policy analysis. In addition to sharing with Caitlin Zaloom being an ethnographer, he has also published his most recent book with the University of Chicago Press, How It Works, Recovering Citizens in Post-Welfare Philadelphia. And Kristen Tompkins is a PhD student in anthropology, writing a dissertation on the politics of public education reform in New Orleans, and has also written on the politics of teachers' unions, and I believe also taught. So please join me in welcoming Caitlin Zaloom.
Thanks, Evelyn, and thanks to Bernard and to Anwen for organizing this event. I took to heart Bernard's suggestion that I develop something for this conference that would be provocative, and to do that, I'm going to respond to some very recent events in the public domain. So hopefully some of them will sound familiar to you, and I'm doing that to try to start to think about what might come after risk as in the way of public justifications for markets. And in other words, this is about as provisional as it kind of gets, but I'm hoping that in its provisionality it will create some openings that we can all discuss together. So I'm going to start with something that happened on March 14th that some of you might have read about in the newspaper, which is an op-ed that was published in the New York Times by a man named Greg Smith, who resigned very publicly from Goldman Sachs. And in his public resignation, he penned a broadside against Goldman's corrupt culture, and this ignited a firestorm that went, far beyond his the op-ed page, and it ignited another round of hand-wringing about the lack of reform and contrition on Wall Street in the wake of the 2008 crisis. I'm going to read you the most provocative passage because I think that it sets the stage for the kind of conflict that I'm going to ask you to consider with me. Greg Smith said that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that the junior analyst sitting quietly in the corner of the room hearing about Muppets, ripping eyeballs out and getting paid doesn't exactly turn into a model citizen. And so Muppets and ripping eyeballs out are, of course, the kind terms that the New York Times could publish, and not, in fact, the terms that would be more common on a trading floor, which are much less kind, which would ignite even more anger. But the criticism centers on the treatment of clients here, the Muppets. What accounts for this kind of behavior and this kind of attitude? We have some culturally available explanations. The first one, of course, is arrogance. And that's the belief that on Wall Street, and particularly at Goldman, that they should be able to pursue profit at others' expense because they are, after all, the winners in a Darwinian economy. And they deserve their winnings. And Goldman's PR department displays this kind of superior stance when the spokespeople call their critics either ignorant or dim. That's pretty much the line of reasoning. The other common explanation would be greed, the sinful excess in pursuit of wealth and power, which is summed up by Matt Taibbi's extremely famous at this point description of Goldman Sachs as a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. A description that I can't resist because it is quite an image. And of course, public protests have used both of these explanations as rallying points very effectively. And they're effective because they hold finance to a morality beyond the pursuit of profit. Yet there's a lot that such explanations obscure, and I believe that that's where we need to focus, particularly as anthropologists, to examine what lies behind or beyond these eternal infractions, and instead to investigate what the ethical order of Wall Street is actually composed of. So the first clue lies in what can seem like a paradox, particularly given the behaviors that someone like Smith describes, and that's that Wall Streeters want to do well, but they also believe themselves to be good. So how can we understand Wall Street actions as accountable to a set of responsibilities, ones that these professionals can and do fulfill? Examining financial ethics, I believe, can reveal a critical mechanism for reproducing the practices and the attitudes that Greg Smith and so many others have decried. They are an important point of the reproduction of Wall Street itself. So I wanted to introduce what I see as the essential conflict in Smith's story, which is an ethic of commerce in combat with what I'm going to call the ethic of liquidity. Smith's story frames a tale of executive moral decline. In earlier years, he says, Goldman has possessed a really exemplary culture, actually one that is centered on teamwork, integrity, a spirit of humility, and always doing right by our clients, he says. But at the firm today, he asserts the interests of clients continue to be sidelined, which sounds mild, in the way the firm operates and thinks about making money. He's resigning, he says, because he can't, in good conscience, identify with what Goldman now stands for. And these are important phrases, conscience and stands for, because it actually implies that Goldman stands for something beyond the simple pursuit of profit. So the question is, what is that thing, and how does that ethic propagate itself? Making money is obviously the short answer, and agreed explanation would end here, but considered from the point of view of ethics, we can refocus our attention from sinful infractions to the level of everyday practice. So both in firm strategies and the everyday situations that confront salespeople and traders, financial ethics help answer a critical question: how to make profit, from whom, and how much. So I see this as based in a conflict between the two sets of ethics that I mentioned, each of which is organized around distinct categories of persons and obligations and duties among them. The first, the commercial ethic, centers on the relation between clients and providers of a service. The service providers are bound to recognize and to aid the interests of clients. And Greg Smith's indignation is on the part of his clients, but it's also a kind of assertion that leaves him vulnerable to the common speculation in the wake of his op-ed that actually what he was doing was creating the first great PR move for his own fund. The ability to serve the client is predicated on trust and built around practices that allow customers both to reveal their true positions to their service provider and to act on that, on the kinds of knowledge and oftentimes prudential positions that they construct together. Treating unsophisticated clients as Muppets exploits this trusting relation and inserts provider and customer into a rival ethic and also a rivalry between themselves. And this is where I think the ethic of liquidity starts to become apparent. The ethic of liquidity begins with the figure of the trader or the market maker as a critical conduit, the link between buyer and seller. The responsibilities here, the responsibilities of the market maker, are to the production of price and to transaction. So market makers do have a set of responsibilities, but they sound quite minimal, and I think that minimalness is actually really important. Their responsibilities are to quote a price and an amount for that that they will buy or sell at that price, and to maintain that price throughout the course of the transaction. Their legitimacy is based on this idea of producing market transactions. So the role of the market maker as a good, as a kind of social good, is in the orchestration of opposing positions. And the operation of speculation, which they then take on, is seen as necessary for their presence in the marketplace. So that speculation is this kind of displacement that happens from the client books onto the speculator. But the kind of social benefits of this extend beyond the pure money motive, and the benefits of this action for the market makers themselves extend beyond the money motive. Instead, they evoke a responsible action that is about enhancing the operation of the market itself. And responsible action is always in the operation of an ethic of liquidity reactive to the demands of the market. So in other words, producing liquidity engages the market maker in reflection on their place within a collective, but the collective is the collective of the market itself and their responsibilities to it. So what interventions would I like to make into our discussions of risk today? I want to put forward that, that liquidity now operates as its own form of justification. So not only for traders themselves in the way that I've been describing, but also in the public forum when markets come under questioning and the purpose of markets comes under questioning. This is a place where risk has historically taken the lead. The public justifications for markets, especially derivatives markets like the futures markets here in Chicago, or the over-the-counter derivatives markets, which were implicated in the 2008 crash, those markets have always been justified by their relationship to risk, and specifically to risk mitigation. But today, I'm going to argue that I'm seeing a shift in public justifications from risk to liquidity, and or at least an emergence of a tension between these two forms of justification. Market makers now use liquidity arguments in public, and I think it'll be interesting to see, given the $2 billion lost at J.P. Morgan in the last 2 days, what will happen as far as what kinds of justifications go on in the wake of that debacle. But my guess would be that actually little will change. So what is important about these public justifications? We need to move from reflections that market makers make to themselves to how market makers mount arguments about their value to the public. And liquidity works as a public justification because it signals an accepted ethics around the production of markets. Risk-taking is a critical element in ethics organized around creating liquid markets. So they're not totally separated, but risk-taking actually becomes kind of a feature or an element in the justification for liquidity. if we reorient to risk as the production of liquidity rather than risk mitigation, say, then certain features that are usually taken as central to the modern risk project start to look quite different. And in particular, I believe that the idea of a future orientation and also of the production of knowledge start to take on a different kind of cast. And so that's where I'm going to end today. Okay, some lessons from the futures trading floor of Chicago, which is where I did the research for my book, Out of the Pits. The futures trading floors of Chicago have always provided their own justification through the mitigation of risk. And in making these arguments about the risk mitigation that happens on the trading floors of Chicago or now on their servers, they've created a link between the domain of markets and politics. So part of what I'm trying to do is to shift from trying to understand the rationality of what happens among market makers to the rationality of what happens between market makers and the public. The legitimate existence of these markets has always been associated with mitigating the specific risk of producing commodities and service to clients that are outside the market, whose interests are linked to financial transactions that are linked to processes beyond the market. So instead of it being internal to the market, the legitimacy is based on creating some kind of link to something outside of it. An old video that used to show in the visitors gallery at the Chicago Board of Trade, I think, is a really good example of this. So before 2001, you used to be able to go to the Chicago Board of Trade and sit in a room that overlooked the trading floor, and they would show you a little video. And this video was geared toward a particular kind of public, the public of kind of school kids who would come and visit, and to the general tourist trade that the Chicago Board of Trade was actually quite a large part of. In that video, it begins with a shot of a farmer riding around on his tractor, of course. One farmer, not ConAgra, but the lone farmer riding around on his tractor, and it gives you an explanation about how, in fact, the risk that this farmer faces based on the weather, so whether or not it's going to rain enough and his crop will produce, or whether the price for his crop will go up or down, is in fact mitigated by what happens at the Chicago Board of Trade. So they're creating a link between these two elements, that the farmer is able to hedge his risk by entering into these kind of speculative contracts that the Chicago Board of Trade allows. And the Board of Trade, obviously here, being the ones that produce the markets that allow the farmer to hedge their own risk. But this link between production and futures markets has always been extremely attenuated. And in the late 19th century, a legal concept began to be developed, which I think shows just how strangely forged this link is. And that is a concept called contemplating delivery. So in the 19th century, just the simple existence of futures markets was always being called into question. And legal decisions at the time landed on this idea about contemplating delivery as a way to justify the legitimacy of futures markets. And that was a response to the idea that futures markets were simply betting halls, that only benefited those or create losses for those who are involved inside the market itself. But this idea about contemplating delivery tied what was happening on the financial markets to the processes of production. And so what is contemplating delivery? The idea was that as long as the futures traders had in their mind when they were making their deal that there might someday be a load of wheat delivered based on their exchange, that was enough to form the legitimacy of the exchange. Of course, this is an extremely attenuated kind of connection and one that's utterly unenforceable. I mean, literally raising the question, what were you thinking? But the point being that this connection was always very attenuated, but that the legitimacy of something like a futures market came through the idea of hedging, of the connection between the productive process and what was happening inside the markets. Now, the rise of liquidity as a public justification is something really different. Today, producing liquidity does not need to refer to any kind of security that it's producing outside. The ethic of liquidity instead displays a recursive logic. Risk-taking inside the market serves liquidity, therefore deepening the market, that's the term, making more trading possible. To make a market is to make the market more liquid, which increases the ability to trade. So the outside is now gone. We can see this in moments of public challenge where market defenders have to justify their own legitimacy or perhaps adapt to critique. And the 2010 Senate Governmental Affairs hearings, which some of you may have watched, were just such an opportunity. Carl Levin was the kind of main showstopper, the Democrat from Michigan, as he was the main showstopper as he grilled a panel of Goldman Sachs executives on their Timberwolf deal, which was a derivative deal for $600 million in securities. An email exchange among Goldman employees had declared Timberwolf a shitty deal, and that was a term that Levin took every opportunity to repeat. And Levin's questioning came to a crescendo as he asked how much money or how much in the deal Goldman salespeople had sold to clients after declaring Timberwolf a shitty deal. Daniel Sparks, the Goldman Sachs head of mortgages, answered this way. He said, "Mr. Chairman, I don't know the answer to that, but the price would have reflected the levels that they wanted to invest in at the time." Levin then responds, "But you didn't tell them that you thought it was a shitty deal." So what we're seeing here, I mean, first of all, is that these two ethics are completely talking past each other. They're not connecting whatsoever, and that's that probably for the head of the mortgages department, not exactly a deflection, but simply a separation. The client is simply not important in the rhetoric of the market maker, in the ethics of liquidity. The position of the market maker allows Goldman to justify an intelligible, defensible, and even on its own terms, desirable position. Responsibility to price and liquidity rises above the interests of their clients when they are viewed simply as counterparties. References to the qualities of the persons on the other side of their trade serves as justification. So in this testimony, Goldman's clients are always positioned as sophisticated investors. In other words, they know what they're doing. Whatever their knowledge is happens at a site of production outside of their relation to Goldman, and that Goldman is simply the transacting party. That they are providing the ability to transact, but these sophisticated investors can take care of their own needs of calculation. Of course, this is very different than the Muppets. They're declaring them later, but we can just set that to the side. Okay. So in the ethic of liquidity, the ability to transact is positioned as its own kind of public good, one that can justify actions which seem beyond the pale under an ethic of commerce. So that liquidity itself, the ability to transact, is something that we should invest in socially on its own. And speculators create the ability to trade. So speculators themselves have a social value. Liquidity as an ethic turns on enhancing the operation of the market, now disconnected from the mission of security. The responsibility is to making markets themselves. The contemporary Goldman culture that Smith describes then can ultimately be understood as an orientation to facilitating interactions between dealers positioned on opposite sides of the trade. Goldman representatives account for themselves in these hearings, but also in other places, not as advisors to clients, but as market makers, essentially as traders among traders. And this kind of explanation is one that actually also has currency beyond their own world in op-ed pages and commentators. This kind of justification travels beyond their own sphere. When the market is placed at the center of commercial life, the critical categories of persons emerge from these competition-based arrangements. And in turn, this generates a moral apparatus, sets of responsibilities, and ideas about virtuous action. So the political conclusion here would be that investigating market ethics can expose the logic of justification for actions that simply don't comport with other sets of ethics that we might like to, in fact, promote. The conceptual conclusion, I believe, has two elements to it. The first is that we think of risk temporality as being future-oriented. But the temporality of liquidity is really quite different. And the temporality of liquidity is tied to market movements which fluctuate minute by minute, which change all the time. The temporality of the market maker is one that's in the moment, and not in a long-term anticipatory mode, but an anticipatory mode that is very, very short, so short to be compressed into the moment, to be able to quote a price to a client who calls immediately, to be able to transact. That kind of compression is something that is, I think, very different than the risk temporality we're used to thinking with. The other conceptual conclusion, I think, is that we have to think differently, perhaps, about what we think of as risk knowledge. These are the elaboration of future scenarios, which we heard about before, or the extrapolation of the future based on past patterns, statistical past patterns, say, or archival past patterns, both of which are in some ways a search for some kind of certainty. Knowledge and liquidity, however, is really minimal, and it's also provisional. It provides the ability to make a decision to transact in the present, but it doesn't anticipate much at all. So when we move forward in thinking about risk, perhaps one of the things that we can think about is what the apparatus of risk has produced, and that is the infrastructure of liquidity, which I think we should deal with conceptually as well. Thank you.
Try this. Can everybody hear this? Good enough. Okay. Thank you very much, Caitlin. And as I mentioned to you before, but I'll now make public, I unfortunately only found my way to your book this morning, literally this morning, and I was fascinated by it, so I really look forward to reading the whole thing. But that's a preface, even though I've been taught to never apologize for a talk before you start talking. To say that I may be kind of creating or doing you a favor of building a big tunnel that you can drive the truck of your book right through, right? Because there's a lot that I'm going to ask you to kind of flesh out on these very provocative, very provisional arguments that you put on the table about the shift from risk to liquidity, that a large part of the constellation of the historical backdrop for this shift, I imagine, is well fleshed out in your book, and I already got a sense for that. But it might serve us well, at least in terms of further discussion, to try and once again fill out or flesh out the possible historical turn that we're looking at, right? So I started this by looking at a little bit more closely at Smith's op-ed in the New York Times, and I think it's worth just extracting a couple more quotes. Smith says, "I have always taken a lot of pride in advising my clients to do what I believe is right for them, even if it means less money for the firm. This view is becoming increasingly unpopular at Goldman Sachs, and this was another sign that it was time to leave." So, I mean, certainly a sign that it was time to leave for Greg Smith, but perhaps also a sign of the times of a shift, right? A broader kind of macro structural shift here. A shift even, as I want to suggest today, in regimes of accumulation and modes of regulation, which I certainly think is the direction your paper prompts us toward. Smith also says when the history books are written about Goldman Sachs, they may reflect that the current chief executive officer, Lloyd Blankfein, and Gary D. Cohn, lost hold of the firm's culture, right? It was very interesting here that the object of analysis here is culture. And I truly believe that this decline in the firm's moral fiber, my emphasis, represents the single most serious threat to its long-term survival. He implores the board of directors at Goldman Sachs, therefore, to weed out the morally bankrupt people, no matter how much money they make for the firm, and get the culture right again, right? So people want to work here for the right reasons, whatever those may be. And people who care only about making will not sustain the firm, right, or the trust of its clients for very much longer. So I think there's a lot of significance in this op-ed itself that sort of is putting its finger. There's a kind of nostalgia, right? It's evident here that marks a kind of possibility of maybe even an epochal shift, right, in regimes of accumulation and modes of regulation that I want to try to get at today. I mean, there's always been this tendency, a lot of Keynesian economists have marked what speculation has always done in markets is introduced instability, right? Speculation and short-term gain necessarily implies foregoing long-term commitments and investments in land, labor, and capital. And this introduces volatility or instability into markets, and we've certainly seen an acceleration of this across the 20th century. Smith, however, seems to suggest that this instability historically, in his generation anyway, was regulated by a kind of moral fiber, right? That this kind of self-policing and also a kind of clientelism. And both of these are kind of under erasure or certainly waning, I think, in this shift from risk to liquidity that you're trying to map here. So I wanted to just pull out, if we're trying to kind of flesh out a turn here from risk to liquidity, some of your discussion on risk in your book, just as a little bit of background so that we can maybe see what we're possibly moving away from a little bit more. You talk about futures markets in the book as their kind of reason for being is to manage risk and the temporal nature of risk, particularly in terms in the way disjunctions between the present and the future create conditions of fundamental uncertainty. There's a model predicated on the generation and regulation of uncertainty here as what I'm going to ask us to think about as a kind of, and I think you do as well, as a new mode of agonism, right? Or you use terms like co-constituted or constitutive, right? And perhaps of new modes of governance. And these types of risk management strategies, or even the concept of risk itself, operate as kind of an instrument and an effect of financialization, right? And hedging tools are perhaps a key marker in this. As hedging tools, futures contracts work to colonize the future, you say, limiting dangerous exposure by bringing the problem of future prices under the influence of the present. And as such, futures exchanges are quintessentially modernist institutions, right? I really like this conception. The contracts traded, therefore, bring the contingencies of passing time under human management. And of course, the other side of risk is it meets the self-interest of the subject by bringing the reward, right, in money, in status, in desire. And with this performance of and want-seeking, the elaboration of the social space of markets is ensured, and the construction of the masculine itself. The economic men, I think, is the chapter in your book that you talk about in this modality that's mostly spoken about in terms of Chicago Board of Trade, which I take to be perhaps the almost not quite a foil, but the passing kind of era here. So at issue is the elaboration of the social space of markets and in a concomitant or elaboration of economic selves. Okay. So we have here this idea that the production of goods or investment vehicles and the production of markets requires constant assertion and repair, constant making and remaking, right? and perhaps in line with that, a capacity to remake institutions and even state power, which is where I'll go at the end of this talk. Risk-taking, therefore, can be seen as challenges to the constraints of bureaucratically organized structures and social routines. Just as Professor Ewald's work shows about insurance, there is an emancipatory capacity here to outstrip vestigial institutional forms like the church, the family, and so on, but bureaucratic forms and state forms and so on, and a liberation here that comes with risk-taking that I think your work is importantly getting at. So risk is a constitutive feature of contemporary power and economic practice. I think, if nothing, that this week has established that firmly. There's two possible levels of intervention that come out of the paper that you've written for us today. I think the remaking of rules, right, the rules of markets, and we're thinking about that in precise terms of regulation, and the remaking of subjectivity. I want to add here, toward the end of the talk, or my part of it, a third possibility in the remaking of states, which seems somewhat possibly absent here in the turn to liquidation. So liquidation, what is it? Examining liquidity as an organizing cultural principle, as you try to do, shows a new financial ethics, right? Which is a crucial mechanism for reproducing both the practices and attitudes connected to producing markets. And you talk about the market maker, right, who directs attention to liquidity. You speak about at one point the continuous ability to transact and the order of justification that ties the world of the market to the political domain. Nonetheless, though, you seem to fluctuate back and forth between the political domain, and here I am conceiving in a very conventional, maybe banal terms of capital P political domain, and say that nonetheless, there is this new ethic raises the market as an end of itself, right? So in terms of the financial ethic, there's nothing outside of the market here, right? The relationship of individuals to the wider system of financial capitalism is there, producing liquidity, making the market itself. But ultimately, I'm going to kind of wonder here how you're conceiving of politics in this piece. What sort of politics are being performed? Okay. I have a question about the public good as well, but I'm not going to go into that directly. I consider this to be a very timely intervention, the risk to liquidity move that you're making here. Crisis-driven urban restructuring in the late 20th century, perhaps more importantly in the early 21st, has certainly induced a burgeoning of governance strategies that are new and in urgent need of study, as many have shown. The governance of systemic social insecurity requires highly differentiated modes of regulation and governance, and otherwise inscrutable forms of state selectivity. It depends crucially on novel informal modes of regulation, and it also requires a strategic remaking of vestigial forms and intermediaries, often operating in kind of buffer zones vis-a-vis the more conspicuous formal institutions. So contemporary forms of statecraft charged with the regulatory restructuring of the neoliberal economy mobilize a wide-ranging yet interrelated sets of logics and political rationalities. And many of these operate opaquely, unstably, deep within the folds of the social, the urban, and the informal. So I'm certainly with you in your ethnographic sensibility, methodologically, of trying to get at these with ethnographic methods. My own work has tried to discern these shifts by invoking state regulation theory and governmentality, and these are the two rubrics under which I'm going to pose my two questions. State regulation theorists first have assumed a prominent role in mapping the local exigencies of institutionally inherited landscapes, as well as the uneven rescaling and activation tendencies of regulatory change. Urbanists like Neil Brenner, Jamie Peck, Nick Theodore have advanced concepts like structurally constituted variegation, uneven development, institutional differentiation as points of departure. And they've shown convincingly that neoliberalism does not outwardly pulsate from a single control center or heartland or centralized authority, nor can it be adequately theorized in the type of complex that's typically associated with structural Marxism. The story of neoliberalization is not one of a fully formed, coherently functioning regime-like state, but rather one of relationally constituted and polyvalent processes that unfold across multiple sites and spaces of co-formation. So the problematic of variegation is central to their analysis. And they say that neoliberalization can only be understood, in fact, as a politically reconstructed, nonlinear, and indeed mongrel phenomenon. The methodological implications of these statements are quite complex. They demand a rethinking of contemporary analyses of political economy. And they ask the question, how are we to go about the elusive, perhaps even imponderable task of mapping the infiltration and reworking of these kinds of restructurings that are at stake? Okay, so coming back to the notion of liquidity, or perhaps considering liquidity as a new mode of regulation, or a new mode of accumulation, that articulates with a new regime of regulation in the contemporary present. We might begin this just by asking, as cultural critic Matthew Arnold states of the concept of freedom, as cited by David Harvey, freedom is a good horse to ride, but it's a horse to ride somewhere, right? So if we consider that liquidity may be a good horse to ride and ask the question of where it is taking us, part of my question is in line with this provocation: what is the work of liquidity in the realm of restructuring, both in terms of social regulation again and regimes of accumulation, and ultimately on contemporary state forms? There's a second line, so that's the first kind of overarching question here. How can we kind of flesh out liquidity and the significance of this term in the state regulation theory approach of being suggestive of a new regime of accumulation and mode of social regulation? The second is to consider, however, another possible way of thinking about this. Liquidity as a mechanism of redistribution, in quite old-fashioned terms. Maybe just consider liquidity as a redistributive mechanism for redistributing wealth upwards, right? Again, invoking Harvey, perhaps thinking about it as a mechanism of accumulation by dispossession, but via a new form of ground monopoly rents, or perhaps ungrounded monopoly rents, if we must. So using a very kind of old-fashioned concept, if we think of ground monopoly rents, we think of actors that actually generate and deepen conditions of volatility in order to designate a field of management and extraction, right, and accumulation by dispossession. And I wonder the extent to which it's useful to think about financialization, right, as a regime of accumulation in this way, right, that operates a new, a mode of monopoly rent that is in some ways contiguous and shows continuity to older forms, but in important ways needs to also be historicized. And the last question I have then is a consideration of the reformulation of the state. And this, of course, brings in Foucault. As we've discussed all week, for Foucault, it's the tactics of government at the level of individual conduct, as you discuss in the Ethics of the New Trader. For Foucault, these ethics are important to the extent that they make possible the continual definition and redefinition of what is within the competence of the state and what is not. The state as such can only be understood, Foucault says, in its survival and in its limits on the basis of the general tactics of governmentality, which shift perpetually based on the nature of its agents, right? In my field, in social welfare restructuring, governmentality theorists emphasize the way in which urban policy knowledges forge links between fiscal austerity projects and the capillary systems of consent operating at the level of conduct and ethical subjectivity. But in reference to liquidity, I'm wondering how we can further historicize the move you make here from risk to liquidity. That's part A of question 3, sorry. And part B, how do we bring the state back in to this analysis? Even though I think to some extent I understand you to be pushing it out of the ethics of financialization, but that could be wrong or a very kind of straightforward reading. Foucault, as we've heard all week from Professor Ewald, insists that we mark changes in the story, right? Our task is to understand the conditions of possibility and historical shifts. And in this regard, I think considering the emphasis that you place on agency in your work of these day traders and ethics as well, we have to kind of consider what was so furtively productive about liberalism for Foucault, or about laissez-faire, and that is it has an inherent critique of reality, an inherent critique of the size, scale, and scope of the state. It seems to me then the only thing that's interesting about micro-level agency and ethics is the extent to which it rescales, remakes what is within the realm of competence of the state and what is not. And I guess that's what I want to kind of try to draw out here in your work. So, in closing here, I think you certainly suggest a remaking of subjectivity, and this begins with Greg Smith's op-ed, I think, that suggests there's an evacuation of morality and an evacuation of clientelism that opens the door for your analysis of subjectivity and an ethic of liquidity. But for Foucault, it seems we need to take another step and ask, how does the ethics of finance operate in a kind of agonistic fashion, a provocative regulatory relationship that makes and remakes the state as well? Is it possible to think of it in these terms, in addition to remaking the social and remaking the market? Okay, I'll stop. Thanks.
I'd like to thank the organizers for the opportunity to comment on this paper, and I also for you for offering it. It was very provocative for me and my work, especially as it concerns the ways that financial professionals are very involved with school reforms. Let's see. I can appreciate the way that your paper calls for us to focus on the humans that operate as a key node of capitalist infrastructures, and furthermore attempts to humanize them as more than just the cartoons of giant squid, or maybe just those assholes that some of us probably went to school with. So I have two main comments in response to the paper. A big focus of this paper is on how liquidity serves as an ethical justification for the work of traders. My question is, justification for who? Or whom? I don't really remember. And how? At times, an ethics of liquidity seems to work as a self-justification, perhaps answering the question, how do these guys live with themselves? However, they also can serve as a justification and a producer of virtue for the public. Now, what I wonder and what I hope we can talk about is, what public? Whose public? I want to highlight three places that this public, which needs justification, shows up in the paper and the talk. One is the various reading publics of the New York Times. The second one is the publics of the congressional hearings from Goldman Sachs in 2010, which can include, but is not limited to, members of Congress, citizens and non-citizens in attendance, and folks at home following through the media, like Fox News, MSNBC, or for the younger crowd, more likely The Daily Show or Colbert Report. And then the third public, which we see from the testimony of Goldman's fabulous Fab Touré, is the sophisticated investor. What struck me was that these are very specific kinds of publics. They sound like the kind of people that may be or at least feel important enough to demand legitimation from finance. But they aren't the only folks out there. I think our conversation on risks and the ethics of liquidity could profit from an exploration of the contours of inclusion and exclusion of various publics, of their shaping and their participation in a justificatory apparatus. If the ethics of liquidity serve a crucial legitimating function in contemporary capitalist projects, my question remains, who are the objects of this legitimation and why them, but not others? By entertaining this question, we can possibly better understand the persistence of coercive and excluding forms of power and their imbrications with potentially non-coercive powers that, say, is a goal of what we've discussed over the past few days with Francois Wald and Gary Becker and Bernard Harcourt as neoliberalism. Now, speaking of these conversations, and since this is a brainstorm, I want to meander a bit from the trading pits. I want to talk about a dream I had. I woke up yesterday to prepare for this conference, and before I awoke, I had a dream in which I was back home in San Francisco, and I was at my middle school in this modernist building, and I was being treated like I was 13 years old again. And I remember having this feeling that I was protesting this treatment. And I said, I'm not supposed to be here now. You guys don't need to worry about me anymore. I am in a PhD program at the University of Chicago. I am not a risk to anyone anymore. And the reason I mention this dream, and the reason that it's so crazy to me that I had it before this conference, is because of the figure it represents. On Wednesday, specifically the conversation that Bernard hosted with Francois Vald and Gary Becker, this figure of the young African-American male from the ghetto came up several times, and then he came up again this morning. And then he's sitting right here at this table. And he came up as the object of underinvestment by human capital theories. And before I read Zaloom's paper, I thought that this figure, despite its gender elisions and simplifications, could be actually really important to a conversation on risk. In the dream I talked about, I was pulled back to my days as an at-risk youth, which is now kind of a outmoded term, still works. This figure embodied by the young black male from the ghetto can be a counterpart figure to the trader who embraces an ethics of liquidity. One is at risk, and the other is the risk taker. They seem to be worlds apart, but they actually come into contact all the time. My research is on the politics of education reform in New Orleans after Katrina, and specifically on how the state government took over the public schools in New Orleans and has been converting them into charter schools, which are publicly funded by privately run schools. And I actually, before I started this research, taught at a charter school in New York City for a few years. And the board of trustees on these charter schools are full of financial professionals and executives. And they would visit our classrooms almost weekly to decide if they were going to donate money and take a risk on black children. And so this is a node where the subjects of the ethics of liquidity leak out, or in the case of Katrina and the rapid reforms afterwards, flood into state institutions like public schools. For example, when I was interviewing for my job as a teacher at this charter school, they told me, Christian, this job isn't going to be like working at a regular public school. It's going to be more like working at a law firm. This is an example of the ways in which charter schools, because they are not unionized, and in fact, by replacing public schools with charter schools, you're breaking the teachers' unions. This allows for a flexibility of reshaping teaching labor into what what recruiters in New Orleans that I talked to called talent or human capital. And so it's just very interesting to me how the kinds of ethics of liquidity end up in other spaces in the state, like Rob has mentioned before. I was also struck by Greg Smith's quote that Caitlin had mentioned earlier about his worries about how the ethics of liquidity that he was seeing, the moral corruption he was seeing, would make it so that the young analysts at Goldman Sachs would not be model citizens. Because it showed to me that there are contemporaneous anxieties about how both junior analysts and black males might become moral subjects. They are and responsible subjects. They're both figures which are presented as present-oriented and they're often both derided as pathologically amoral. However, one is considered a master of risk, and the other is subject to risk, or even a risk itself to society, or maybe just your wallet. What I'm trying to get at here is that maybe an ethics of liquidity doesn't just create subject positions in the market, but that maybe they also help to craft the very inclusions and exclusions which shape the publics that they feel they need to address.
Those are great sets of questions. They're quite different. So.
All right,
Go ahead, yeah.
Shay, have at it. So those are really provocative questions, and they both address the question of the political constitution of something like the ethics of liquidity. And I like that Rob raised this question about the agonistic relationship to the state, because of course this is a traditional one for the market. This is, in fact, exactly what is being produced in these public forums, is the agonistic relationships of the state. Because as we know very well, and as Bernard has written extensively about, markets are regulatory. I mean, they are constituted through regulation. But in fact, one performance that is happening in the kinds of public forums like the New York Times and the congressional hearings is actually the separation of the market and the state. So that I mentioned in this exchange between Carl Levin and the Goldman Sachs executives that they're talking past each other. That talking past each other is important, and it's also the constitution of a specific kind of exclusion. Now, we usually think of exclusion as being oriented socially downward. We're excluding people from participation in something. But these market makers produce their own kind of exclusion from the rationalities of governance. Here, from where they're being called in front of the congressional panel to respond to questions. So they're actually, by creating this sort of separate world and separate rationality, creating their own form of exclusion. We are actually not governable by the sorts of, or we are not governed by the sorts of ethics that you are invoking, Carl Levin, is what the Goldman Sachs executive is saying. We are governed by the ethics of making markets. Carl Levin, on the other hand, is saying you should be governed by client relationships, by your responsibilities to your client. And in fact, Olympia Snow, and which I mentioned in the paper, one of those Republicans.
Those main Republican women.
Those ish Republicans. Exactly. She says that, she asked very directly, do you have a responsibility to your clients? And or to serve your clients' interests? And the response is, we have a responsibility to serve our clients well. Or it's a complete dodge of the question. But the point that I'm trying to make is that exclusion is actually a really important part of this political relationship between markets and politics, which I just mean in a capital P sense. The kind of congressional hearing sorts of politics that I've described. So is it a kind of agonistic relationship? I'm not even I'm not even sure that agonistic quite gets at it, because in fact it's one of slippage, of rhetorical or discursive slippage. And so the idea that Carl Levin would be able to kind of combat this becomes something that gains in the end not much traction, even under conditions where there should in fact be a direct confrontation. So the question of exclusion also, I think, brings up the question of how something like and ethics of liquidity constitute particular kinds of collectivities or denies others. And the kind, I mean, one, I think, really interesting, and maybe this is a historical specificity, is that since the globalization of markets has kind of taken hold, I mean, really, I guess, since the 1980s, the financial workforce has become more and more global, right? And it's located in very specific global sites. I mean, as we know, Chicago for derivatives, but New York, London, Singapore, Dubai. And there's also an interesting kind of speculation going on right now, or maybe a kind of street level conversation about that asks the question, to what political collectivity do financial professionals see themselves responsible? And I think that this starts to get to your point about these schools, partially, Christian. That one answer to this question is no polity, right? That they are in fact responsible to the market and not necessarily to the state, the city in which they work, in which they were born. That these kinds of associations have become extremely attenuated. Of course, there are benefits for investing or giving donations to things like schools that are responsive to states, but the question of allegiance is another one. So that I think that is to begin to address the question of kind of what kinds of exclusions and political relations might be at work here. There's an important element too that Rob raised about the historical conditions that have made possible this turn toward liquidity as an ethic. And one, I'll start from. I can start from way back or way back, but an ethic of liquidity, I believe, can be traced back essentially to, in this specific case, to the point of what in the futures markets is called demutualization. Okay, so Greg Smith says that that there used to be this golden age of ethics at Goldman Sachs, and now we have this other liquidity ethics. But Goldman Sachs also used to be a I'm blanking out on the term. It used to be co-owned by the partners in the firm, and now it is a publicly traded company. And part of the ethics of liquidity is also about considering the firm itself as kind of shot through with the qualities of the market. So going public makes the firm responsive not necessarily to clients, but in fact it makes the firm responsive to the conditions under which they are judged themselves, which are the conditions of the equity markets. So that's one element of this. I'm not sure that it's a shift in the regime of accumulation. It seems like an intensification, if anything. But at least since this has started at least in the late 60s, 70s. I mean, especially if we think about Greta Krippner's work on the financialization of the American economy, we can trace it back to the point at which even corporations which are formally invested in the productive sector began to make more profits from financial transactions than from their actual products. So, I think that this is in fact a kind of intensification of that logic, but it's one where the association to production has become so attenuated that that the liquidity that, or I'm arguing that the liquidity of the market has become a justification in itself. It is good to trade. It's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be connected at all to producing stuff. So,
Can I push you on that
Yeah.
a little bit? Because in your talk especially, or I got it more in the talk than I did in reading the paper, you suggested that there was a difference from the Board of Trade film with the farmer plowing his field. And yet, reading the paper and thinking about this in the context of these hearings, one can't help but think of the connection between mortgage-backed securities, and that the connection still is there to the rest of the world. And while in a trading context that may be very attenuated, it's still very, very much there. And I mean, I think you even point that out. But I want to ask you then, given that there is that connection and that's sort of the rationale behind Carl Levin, Susan Collins, and so forth, the Dodd-Frank legislation and the Volcker rule, and I have to read the little Volcker's comments from the other day. Is that liquidity justification really playing for the public the way you think the financial its proponents would have it do? So I just have to read something from a Wednesday hearing. Paul Volcker is testifying, and in the middle, this is available to the New York Times public. Quote, with some prodding from liberal lawmakers, he brushed away the central criticisms facing the rule, the Volcker rule, which tries to eliminate proprietary trading by the investment banks. Will it dry up liquidity, wreaking havoc on the broader economy? Quote, the market seemed to become very liquid before the crisis, he quipped. It led to some behavior that is not very constructive, end quote, citing the boom of subprime mortgages. Will it hurt small-town banks? Quote, the typical community bank is not doing proprietary trading, he explained, saying that the rule applies to, quote, a very concentrated number of banks. So just getting at who the audience is, and given that, especially after Jamie Dimon's comments yesterday, the New York Times says that the Volcker rule stands a better chance of having more teeth than otherwise. What does this make you think about the ethic of liquidity and how it stands with respect to the political sphere or regulation, or however you want to cast that?
Well, I mean, it's certainly there are very strong competing ethics. I mean, and there should be, right? I mean, from my point of view, it's certainly not that I'm trying to say that the ethics of liquidity are good. I'm trying to kind of point out that they're there and a kind of positively active force. But I think there are at least two elements to your question. I mean, the connection to the productive world is certainly, or to the world of assets, if we want to abstract it in that way, outside the market is certainly still there. I mean, and the asset-backed security crisis and the havoc that's been wreaked since then is about as much evidence as you would ever need to point that out. But the point that I'm trying to make is actually about the discursive severing of this, and in fact and I think too there's a part of this that is about trying to form a financial world that is kind of enclosed from both from the consequences and effects of what happens outside of it, which is essentially what mortgage-backed derivatives do, right? They're supposed to nullify the effects of risk so that they can be. I mean, that at least that is their legitimate faith, but try to create this a sphere in which financial professionals can operate that is in fact disconnected from the kinds of consequences that they have produced through the actual connections that do still exist between say, the derivatives trading sphere and the external world. So I'm not saying that they have actually severed it. I'm saying that they are trying extremely hard to discursively sever this, and to tag their responsibilities to the operation of that internal world rather than to the effects of what happens through their trading. And what I believe Paul Volcker is trying to say is that we shouldn't really buy that, right? That liquidity is not an end in itself, right? We can't, Paul Volcker is trying to counter the idea of liquidity as its own kind of good, and even perhaps a public good, or at least that's how they're trying to position it, with some other kind of idea. At least he's not putting forward another positive assertion, but he is saying that in itself is not sufficient.
Do you want to respond to the discussants further, or shall we?
Why don't we open it up and? Okay.
Go ahead.
First, a word of thanks to everybody. I thought that was very, very productive. I was just going to suggest more evidence for I think this your paper helps me clarify or make sense of emails that I've been poring over. Some Tompkins mentioned Fabulous Fab. And if you look at the detail of the emails, there's another public to whom one might address these justifications, chiefly perhaps the one that you cited, how do these people sleep at night or live with themselves? And the other one is his girlfriend. So if you read the emails, he had actually a couple girlfriends. But he was French, so you would expect as much. And so his emails have been excavated, and if you read the detail, he's basically describing how he's trying to sell this deal, this abacus deal. He says all these widows and orphans in Belgian airports are suckers. They're buying them left and right. They love it. And then a little later, he says, might be in a different email, I don't feel too guilty about this. I think that's a quote. He says, then I think he uses his word of his job. His job is to make markets more efficient. But then, I think it's in that sentence, and then he says, it's amazing how I managed to convince myself. And then there's a little wink. And to me, that suggests that there is a conflict, right, between these two ethics. One of which he's clearly aware, which is why he has to justify, and then he has to amend the justification with a little wink. And there's a possibility that this guy actually has a conscience on top of being a crook. So that more evidence, I don't know. Perhaps the question that would follow from this is to what extent the material from which we draw this evidence shapes the kind of arguments you make. Because if you look at the way that, the reason I ended up reading these emails is I was looking at Max Weber's use of Benjamin Franklin to produce he quotes Franklin's advice to a young tradesman as evidence of a distinct spirit of capitalism. But it's in the form of advice. It's like a certain kind of manual from which he's then going to extract a certain kind of ethical principle disposition. But if you look at op-eds versus private emails versus congressional hearings, you're going to get different kinds of material. And it's easier to do when you're looking at things that are 100 years older than you are, but when you're doing it in real time, it opens up all kinds of challenges.
Whose emails are these?
This is Fabrice Toul, who's the only person, Fabulous Fab, who's the only person at Goldman Sachs to be a person other than the corporation itself, of course, who was the target of the SEC's investigation.
So I think that the question of advice on evidence is extremely interesting, an extremely interesting one. And I think that it relates very much to the question of what publics are being addressed, because the kinds of evidence that I went looking for were situations under which there was some kind of conflict between these ethics, which forces justification. It's so the everyday operation of these ethics doesn't necessarily have to be worked out or articulated. It can operate at the level of procedure and habit more than it has to actually call itself out as an objective or as a positive force. And that's very similar to the kinds of advice manuals that you're talking about, or actually even the advice books that Pat discussed around the question of resilience. They're a form of an objectification of the attitude, right? I mean, and that's why it's the sort of, I guess I'm not that I get to be Max Weber, but at least it's the same sort of form of argumentation, even though he was using Benjamin Franklin's advice manuals, and I may be using the congressional hearing.
His advantage was just that the people he was talking about were dead.
I mean, so they can't answer back, or they don't multiply. I mean,
He
one.
could construct the ideal types on the basis of the subject who was imputed to them.
Yeah.
And having to then.
Right. Well, and one issue about the current arena of justification is that it is constant. It is constantly updating, and it exists not only in advice form and on the congressional record, but it happens on. I mean, the media sphere is so vast that the arena of justification is hard to take all into account.
So yeah, I mean, so I'm trying to kind of fit this notion of liquidity into the other categories of risk and post-risk that we played with. Somehow I am sometimes tempted to place it in the earlier category of risk, actually. In the sense that these notions of liquidity generally are tied to reducing volatility. So in other words, in a lot of the literature on liquidity, it's about reducing volatility. And of course, reducing volatility is about reducing risk exposure, right? And so there's a sense in which it actually, it is displacing notions of risk, but staying within a rubric, it seems to me, of mitigating risk, right? Liquidity, I mean, even though the link is through volatility, I think it still is. It's like you can get out of the market if there is a market, right? And so therefore you can reduce your exposure. Whereas when there isn't a market that's made, you're stuck. Now, of course, this doesn't work when markets collapse, as they did in 2008. But I think that's the functioning kind of drive. So it's kind of a mitigation, risk mitigation technique or something that almost, to me, seems to fit classically in notions of socializing or spreading risk. But at the same time, it has this funny relationship to the at-risk, because it's almost as if it's transforming the trader into an at-risk person, like the at-risk unit. Or it's looking at the side of the trader that is at risk, right? Because it's exposed. By making this, you're putting yourself at risk. You know what I mean? Even though it's obviously it's obviously two sides of the coin. They're obviously taking positions to make a lot of money, sometimes failing this. JP Morgan just did yesterday. So that was one thing. So how it fits exactly in this larger kind of constellation of rubrics. I don't see it as I see these folks as probably being perceived or as resilient, but nevertheless, this rhetoric is one that doesn't really go down that path. It seems to and then a couple of other things, I suppose. Maybe I should talk about that. I mean, the obligation, I take it, there's also something about the shareholder in this equation that hasn't been discussed too much, although you did notice that it went from private to public. But I take it that there has to be some notion in this ethic of liquidity versus the ethic of commerce. There's also here going to be something about to the shareholder. which may or may not exist. Right. But that would be important to fit in here somehow. Because there, even if that's not discussed in ethical terms, it certainly is the legal test ultimately, right, is responsibility of the shareholder.
But it's really essential, I think, because when a company goes public, the time horizon for profitability, for return is much shorter, which sort of propelled the shift from doing client-centered deals to doing proprietary trading as a proportion of the business, right? Where the client-centered deals would have a much longer time horizon than the proprietary trading.
I mean, so
Sorry.
yeah. So I think that these are both really interesting questions. Let me take the shareholder question first. Yeah. So there is, of course, a legal responsibility to consider shareholders as the beneficiaries of the corporation. But I think that one thing that's really important to take into account is the kind of shifting structure of these firms. And a sociologist who's done very interesting work on this is Olivier Godichaud, and he in his work has shown how kind of trading desks in this, I mean, in a period where I would say that this kind of liquidity ethic is really flourishing, start kind of moving from firm to firm to firm to firm to firm. So that it's not necessarily their responsibility to maximize profit for the shareholders of their firm. I mean, in fact, it becomes the kind of drive to maximize profit for themselves, to maximize their ability to move either individually or as like a full trading desk from firm to firm to firm. So it's kind of their investment in their own liquid position in a way, rather than an impulse to maximizing the shareholder return of any given corporation. So I mean, that's just one way to a kind of different way to think about it from what the habits interior to an investment bank would be. But there is this, there is definitely a shift. I mean, Goldman Sachs actually becomes a publicly traded firm relatively late compared to these other firms. But this is something that's going on in the industry much more broadly, is to move to the publicly traded status, and it does coincide with what I'm identifying as this ethic of liquidity. So Bernard, the way that you're proposing liquidity certainly does fall under the classical understanding of risk. I mean, if what liquidity does is to reduce volatility, then that provides the less exposure for the clients. Now, what is one interesting thing that's been happening, I mean, and I think that, what we could talk about the financial crisis in this way, is the simultaneity of increased volatility and increased liquidity. Right? So that it's not, so that the risk rationality for increasing liquidity has become really kind of called into question. For instance, I mean, take the case of high frequency trading. And it was also in 2010. I don't know if you remember this event, but there was this thing called the flash crash, which was a stock market crash that happened over the course of like 30 seconds. But share prices as measured by, say, the Dow Jones Industrial Index dropped something like 300 points in exactly. Less than that, half that, and in just a flash, and so there was a simultaneity of an increased number of participants in the market, and then their immediate withdrawal. So that there was what looked like a really highly liquid market that then also became illiquid in a flash. And so that kind of idea that liquidity equals volatility minimization doesn't seem to work as well as it used to. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, liquidity can evaporate, and when it does, you've got huge volatility.
well, yeah. If you wanted to, if you want to read it as a risk logic, I think that is it. You're not.
I think in a Foucauldian perspective, I see this shift as two questions. The first one is how it was possible that a certain part, a certain group in the capitalism takes the power over the other part of the capitalism. Because the story of the shift from this good, the former future who works for the farmer, the risk on the farmer, and the shift to the liquidity, that means a shift between the power in the capitalist institution. Or what is very interesting, but that is not very new, that is the group of traders, that is a broker. The group of persons, they are between the producer and the investor, take the power over the whole system to keep the rent, to keep the profit. I think that is exactly the same, that was what was in the focus of the criticism by Saint Thomas about usure. That is, we have to make impossible that this kind of people, they are between the producer and investor, take the profit, because that is wrong. But we have to understand how this keeping of power was possible. In this form of capitalism, the entrepreneur is each day claims against the financier. That is a complaint of the entrepreneur. That is not a capitalist for entrepreneur. That is a first question. That is what is the game of the power relationship in the modern capitalism in the age of globalization? Naturally, globalization is very important. The question will be: is a broker, that is a lawyer, that is an analyst, that is this one, they are the master of information. The master of information takes the power of the capitalism. How that is mostly on what is the future? And I think the second question, in a Foucauldian perspective, in a criminal direction, that is a question, the question for the state, that is a question of management of illegalism. How today it is possible for the state, or for a state, for one state, in a moment of globalization, to make distinction between different kinds of parties, of financial parties, and to decide that this one is illegal, and another no. That is a very experimental question about what people know illegalist management in discipline and punition. You have that is a very interesting thing in this project.
So, I think that this idea of a shift in power, where essentially the broker becomes the linchpin of the system, is a really is something that I think this ethics of liquidity actually works really well with, because if the broker has to justify itself to other forms of capital, it does so by saying, in fact, that they are the conditions under which transaction can happen. So one thing that I think is interesting to note in this regard is that there are different forms of security at play. So the question of who the clients are that they are either calling sophisticated or Muppets, I think is also very much implicated in what you're saying, because oftentimes those people are pension fund managers, or they're some sort of managers. They're pension fund managers. They're mutual fund managers. They're people who have enough capital under their control that they are working to do deals with Goldman Sachs, and so that kind of shift from the kind of control that is wrested from what, in another kind of more welfare-oriented order would be a power of security, at least enabled by the state. I mean, since pension fund managers are basically, or they're not technically pension fund managers anymore, but the fund managers are essentially in charge of the social welfare of the workers of the country, so that they are kind of relic of another order of capitalism, whereas these kind of bankers that are producing liquidity are actually sort of extracting money from the vestiges of that former order, I mean, by retaining control over it. So I think that broadening out the framework would certainly be productive.
I think we have to end there so that there's time for the final panel. Thank you.
Thank you.